Love, Lost, Rebirth, Alive. Blue Dolphins. The novel, by Makāula Nakae. Chapter 3, Night of the Party. Episode 12, Revelations. After returning from the kitchen, Hanalei handed Jim his wine glass and drifted alone through the carport gate. He stepped out onto the quiet street, casually tilting his head back to look at the night sky. Nearby, tall palm trees rustled softly in the breeze. Thanks to the weed, a gentle wave of relaxation had washed over him, anchoring him in a state of calm. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" Keala's voice drifted from behind him. Hanalei offered a silent smile. The nights in Kāhala were a world away from the neon-drenched noise of Waikiki. Here, it was quiet enough to hear the subtle pulse of the waves on the shore and the melody of hidden insects celebrating the darkness. Under the bright moonlight, the sky was a deep cobalt sphere. If one looked long enough, the river of the galaxy seemed to shimmer into view. They stood in silence, gazing at the stars. Orion was visible above, brandishing his club, though in the islands, that same shape was recognized as the hook of the demigod Māhū, who had pulled the islands from the depths of the sea. Because Kāhala lacked the intrusive streetlights of the city, the constellations shone with a piercing brilliance. "Why did you call Coco he?" Hanalei asked finally. "She looks like a woman to me." It was a genuine question. Looking at her perfectly feminine figure and face, it was impossible for Hanalei to reconcile her presence with anything else. "That's probably because I've known him since we were children," Keala replied. "In my memories, she's still that boy I grew up with. Sometimes it just slips out for no reason." At that time, the language of identity was still rigid. There was only he or she. The concept of ex-gender would come later, and the use of they-them pronouns was non-existent, though the need for them was already bubbling beneath the surface. Even the term queer was only just beginning to lose its sting. To many, it still felt like an extension of queen, a theatrical, flamboyant label for a specific kind of gay persona. They were living in a gap between old definitions and a future that hadn't yet found its words. Understanding that Keala knew her from childhood made sense. Without that shared history, it was impossible to see the boy Coco once was. Hanalei couldn't help but ask if she ever still acted like a man. "Sometimes. But I think he is still navigating that internal confusion between the two," Keala explained. "I see," Hanalei responded. He began to ponder the very nature of gender. Was it determined solely by appearance, or was it a deeper internal frequency? If masculine and feminine behaviors were the measures of identity, the world was full of contradictions. He knew plenty of women with manly drives and men who moved with a soft, feminine grace. "You have to understand," Keala added, "compared to straight men, we are far more complicated. We carry a mix, masculinity braided with femininity. We are fluid, like being versatile in bed. We understand both the insertive and the receptive. Coco is even more complex than we are as gay or bisexual men, or to use the new term, pansexual individuals," Hanalei agreed. He realized that as complicated as his life as a gay man was, the journey for someone like Coco was an even steeper climb. For their generation and those who came before, there were no clear role models or blueprints. The pioneers of gay culture had to forge their own paths through a landscape of social isolation and internal confusion. The movement toward equality hadn't been a quiet transition. It was ignited in the wreckage of the Stonewall riots and tempered in the devastating furnace of the AIDS crisis. It was a history written in blood, literally. Transgender individuals and gay men and women had seen their blood spilled on the pavement in acts of hate, while countless others saw it tainted by a disease transmitted through the very acts of love and sex that were supposed to define them. It was a cruel irony. In those days, the LGBT community didn't own the night as they did now at the tribal parties. The night was often a place of terror and secrecy. They had walked through a long, dark tunnel of survival, only recently reaching a point where they could begin to feel comfortable in their own skin as society slowly, painfully, became more accepting. Hanalei stood in the quiet Kāhala night, the weight of Keala's words sinking in. The miracle of Coco wasn't just in her physical transition, but in the ancestral depth of her spirit, especially in her case. Coco's sensitivity is vastly different from others, Keala said, his voice dropping to a reverent tone. Hanalei looked into Keala's deep brown eyes that held a pure, childlike clarity, and asked if he was referring to her empathic abilities. Yes. Coco often feels, hears, and sees things that ordinary people can't, Keala said, nodding toward the house where the light spilled onto the lawn. You and me, with our Hawaiian blood, our cultural legacy is different. Like the Native Americans on the mainland, we natives have deeper tendencies within our senses. We are tied to our environment. We have the Kāhala, the seers, and the Haka, the mediums. We are highly tied to ancestral and spiritual planes, the realms of the Aumakua. Hanalei listened intently. This was a side of the islands that the neon lights of Waikiki usually drowned out. Many Hawaiians are psychic compared to modern individuals, Keala continued. Especially the older generations who lived through the devastation, the era where Western civilization introduced diseases that nearly wiped us out and silenced our culture. Hawaiians once were telepathic. We communicated through the forehead, the third eye, and through raw feeling. We spoke with ancestors, spirits, and gods. The Maori and the Marquesans are even more telepathic than we are. We cannot discriminate against someone like Coco, who carries the gifts our people once held in common. I understand what you're saying now, Hanalei said softly, a pang of guilt hitting him. But I didn't know about her abilities. I didn't mean to hurt her that night. Keala placed a steady hand on Hinalei's arm, reassuring him that no one blamed him. I think the feeling you triggered brought up hidden emotions and memories within her, which caused her pain, Keala explained with a gentle gravity. Initially, the pain was yours. But because of who she is, it also became his, the boy she was, and hers, the woman she is now. By feeling your pain, her own resurfaced. It was originally your grief, Hanalei, but in that moment, it became a shared burden. The realization left Hanalei silent. He thought of the blue magic and the trance music, realizing that the club hadn't just been a place of escape. It had been a conductor for a psychic electricity he wasn't prepared to handle. Hanalei stood in the deepening shadow of the carport, Keala's words resonating with a truth that felt older than the marble floors of the mansion behind them. He realized that the ability to empathize with another's pain was not just a social grace. It was a primal sensory index, a survival mechanism designed for the creatures of this earth. Without those animalistic instincts, no creature could survive in a savage environment against the more aggressive or robust forces of nature's divine circle. In the wild, we are all prey, and we are all hunters driven by hunger. True empathy, Hanalei mused, requires a prior resonance, a shared experience that allows the receiver to vibrate at the same frequency as the sufferer. Modern culture often looks down upon native or primitive ways of being, viewing them as less supreme than highly intellectual academic civilizations. But Hanalei questioned if this was an evolutionary step forward or a tragic drift. Human intellect has shifted away from wild nature to build concrete, industrial, and now cyber cultures. In doing so, modern humans have walked away from nature itself, isolating themselves from the very life force that once sustained them. From a narrow viewpoint, this seems like evolution. However, in a deeper sense, it feels like a devolution. Modern humans have advanced in technology, yet, ironically, their academic pursuits have encased their minds in a small box. They no longer comprehend the actual reality of life and spirit. By dulling their senses and losing the authentic ability to recognize the animalistic survival instincts based on empathy, they have become disconnected. We think we've grown, Hanalei thought, looking up at the vast cobalt sky, but we've just forgotten how to feel the pulse of the world. In the quiet of Kāhala, away from the neon static of the city, The silence felt like an invitation to remember those lost senses, the same senses that allowed Coco to hear his silent scream on a crowded dance floor. How can one truly feel a pain they have never personally lived? Recalling a memory to intellectually understand someone is a cognitive exercise, but what Coco experienced was something else entirely, a visceral biological resonance. It is the true nature of the circle of life, a collective connection where senses and emotions move in a shared commotion. In that state, there is no you or me, only the pulse of the collective. If every person on earth could feel the physical sting of another's sorrow as their own, the world would naturally quiet into peace. Cruelty would become self-inflicted pain. I can't imagine what it's like to see and feel someone else's pain, Hanalei said softly. He was still struggling to live with his own, a heavy ghost-filled past where the paradise he once knew with Kevin felt like it was fading into the mists of Avalon. He was eager to return to that warmth, but it felt further away with every passing day. To carry his own grief was exhausting enough. To carry the world seemed like an impossible burden. How many people are born with a nervous system tuned to such a high, agonizing frequency? Is it 1 in 10? 1 in a million? In a world that rewards thick skin and dulled senses, a creature like Coco is an anomaly, an open nerve in a room full of armor. It's tragic that such a beautiful creature has such a painful ability, Keala murmured, his voice heavy with a protective sort of grief. The tragedy, Hanalei realized, was that Coco's gift was both her crown and her curse. She was a bridge to a lost way of being, a reminder of the miracle of true connection, but she had to walk that bridge while being burned by the fires of everyone she crossed. The move to the poolside lawn transformed the evening. The transition from the staged interior to the open air under the Kāhala moon breathed life into the gathering. Everyone was now anchored around the long table, the underwater pool lights casting shimmering, dancing reflections against the white walls of the mansion. The table was a concentrated hub of creative energy. Between Coco's passion for the performing arts, Keala's commercial eye, Jim's mastery of fashion, and Douglas's reputation as a fine artist, the air was thick with aesthetic debate. For this group, art wasn't just a hobby. It was the lens through which they dissected the world. Hanalei, however, sat in a pocket of quiet resistance. He felt a familiar prickle of discomfort whenever the word artist was aimed at him. To Hanalei, the term felt too heavy, perhaps even a bit pretentious. He didn't want to be a persona, he wanted to be a maker. While the others engaged in what felt like a conversational battle, a theatrical display of wit and critique, Hanalei's mind drifted toward the tangible. He preferred the silent, meditative challenge of the process, the way a layout snaps into perfect balance, the precise chemistry of a new color palette, or the tactile resistance of rubbing garlic and alaya salt into a steak. For him, the art was in the doing, the sweat, and the execution. He watched the table with a mix of amusement and endurance. To him, the long-winded discussions on artism often felt silly, like people talking about the wind instead of just flying a kite. Yet, the table was undeniably entertaining, a vibrant, messy arena of egos and insights. As the wine flowed and the orchestral music from the Bose speakers drifted out into the night, Hanalei realized that even if he didn't want to join the battle, he was an essential part of the composition. He was the grounded observer, the one who saw the beauty in the salt on his fingertips while the others looked for it in the stars. "I'm fine talking to different people," Scott replied with a relaxed shrug. "Besides, as you probably know, I try not to judge people based on their appearance or sexuality. My job beat that out of me long ago." As a lawyer, Scott explained, he spent his days in the trenches of human nature. He often encountered seemingly ordinary, straight-edged people who turned out to be far more volatile than any eccentric artist. "You've seen how nasty, seemingly normal couples get in divorce cases?" he said, leaning back. "After witnessing that kind of madness, you stop judging people by their cover. Male or female, child or adult, Human nature is built on belief systems and the way life has shaped them. In the end, it's usually about the mind trying to ambush an opponent. It's about who wins and who loses. There aren't many peaceful agreements in my world. It's just the way it is. Coco pushed a bit further, asking his stance on the burgeoning topic of gay marriage. Scott met her gaze with a dry, knowing smile. I believe they should have the right to face the same legal troubles as heterosexual couples, he quipped. The table erupted in a mix of laughter and groans, but Hanalei felt the weight behind the joke. Scott saw the world through the lens of conflict and resolution, the messy reality of emotional betrayal, revenge, and the separation of two souls. Whether it was greed, ambition, or simple ego, he viewed human drama as an inevitable force that simply had to be managed. Hanalei watched Coco's reaction. She seemed impressed by his pragmatism. In a room full of people who lived in the clouds of art and spirit, Scott's grounded, almost cynical realism was a bracing change of pace. He wasn't there to celebrate their uniqueness. He was there to treat them as equals in the eyes of the law and the eyes of human fallibility. Feeling bored with the technicalities of the legal and artistic debate, Hanalei leaned across the table and caught Jim's eye. He lowered his voice, steering the conversation toward something more personal. "What about that guy you met at the last party?" he asked. "The one from LA, you mean Andrew?" Jim's response was immediate, yet his expression shifted into something unreadable. "Yeah," Hanalei pressed. "Did nothing happen?" Jim's answer was a masterclass in ambiguity. "He was a traveler," he said with a vague shrug, exhaling a thin trail of smoke. "So maybe something will happen, but who knows? I'm not looking for a fling." The response was an enigma, tossed out like a blank canvas for the rest of the table to paint their own meanings onto. In this circle, where every word was seasoned with the flavor of the listener's own biases, their theatrical divine comedy Jim knew exactly how to play his cards close to his chest. He wasn't about to let the group dissect his private life for their evening entertainment. Across the table, however, the air suddenly changed. Coco glanced at Jim, her fork pausing halfway to her plate. She didn't just hear his words, she felt the hollow space where the truth should have been. Suddenly, a sharp sensation, like an invisible hand knocking firmly on the crown of her head, jolted her. Her vision blurred for a split second, and the sounds of the party receded into a dull hum. In that void, a rapid, strobe-like sequence of images began to fire through her mind. It wasn't a memory, but a flickering projection. Jim in a different light, a sequence of moments and faces that hadn't happened yet, rushing toward him like a freight train in the dark. Coco gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The playful battle of artistic wits vanished, replaced by a heavy, static, charged silence. She saw him clearly, a man named Andrew. He was tall, in his mid-40s, with short light brown hair and broad, muscular shoulders. The fragments of the vision pulsed with a single, undeniable truth. Andrew was the one who could make Jim truly happy. "Jim," she whispered, her voice cutting through the quiet. "What is it?" Jim asked, his posture stiffening. "I don't know why, but I must tell you this. Something knocked on my head and told me to say this." The entire table was transfixed. "This doesn't happen often, and I'm not joking. Please take this seriously. Don't mess things up with him." "Okay," Jim said, his voice guarded. But why? He wondered if she was judging his history of fleeting flings or trying to lecture him on his habit of keeping men at a distance. Coco began to describe Andrew's appearance in detail, details she had no logical way of knowing. Jim frowned. "Except for the body, you're almost right. He's not muscular or built like that." Coco froze, a sudden realization washing over her. She had seen him at the club, but the man in her vision was different. She wasn't seeing Andrew as he was today. She was seeing who he would become beside Jim. Regardless of his current looks, Coco insisted, her eyes burning with a strange, certain light, he will be your lifelong partner. He will love you unconditionally and you will love him. Jim stared at her, unable to process the weight of the word love. To him, love was a frustratingly abstract concept, a fluid definition that had failed him in the past. Defining love between two men was a labyrinth he had long ago given up on navigating. It wasn't his piece of cake, and it certainly wasn't his vision for the future. Feeling Jim's internal panic, Hanalei reached out and took his hand. He wasn't just offering support, he was vibrating with a sudden enthusiastic joy for his friend, an excitement that Jim couldn't yet mirror. "I can't imagine or believe what you're saying will happen," Jim said finally, his voice small, "but I'll keep it in mind." Coco stood up and moved to his side. She kissed his cheek, the gesture both motherly and prophetic. "I know it sounds strange, but I am certain you will find happiness with him. Keep it in your heart. You'll see." She returned to her seat, her conviction absolute. In the core of her being, in that gut feeling the ancestors called Naiu, there was no room for doubt. The vision was a command from a realm that didn't care about Jim's skepticism. Jim, eager to pivot away from the spotlight of the prophecy, turned the focus toward Hanalei. "Hanalei, what about you? Didn't you meet anyone interesting?" Caught off guard, Hanalei shifted in his seat, explaining that he wasn't seriously looking for a connection. Douglas, leaning in from the next chair, didn't let him off easily. "Why not? You're single, right?" Hanalei nodded silently, hoping the topic would pass quickly. But Jim pushed further. "How long have you been single?" Even Coco, while still engaged with Scott, paused to look at Hanalei, her empathic senses likely already picking up the change in his frequency. 2 years. "And how long did your last relationship last?" Douglas pressed. 8 years. The silence that followed was brutal. In a world where relationships often flickered out like candles in the wind, 8 years carried a weight that everyone at the table could feel. It was a heavy burden to imagine the aftermath of such a collapse. Losing a love battle of that magnitude is rarely a clean break. It is an emotional imbalance that leaves the soul reeling. Everyone there knew someone, or had been that someone, who had fallen into the dark abyss after a long-term split. They had seen the spiral into alcohol, the numbing fog of drug abuse, or the long, slow climb through mental counseling and breakdowns. For some, the fire of that loss keeps burning, making it impossible to move on, while others simply become hard to reach, trapped in the repetitive loop of their own suffering. Hanalei felt the collective weight of the table's gaze. He was lost in his own paradise, where being left alone felt like an ultimate burden with no clear destination ahead. To Hanalei, who spent his days as a graphic designer at a high-pressure firm, life often felt like a series of mechanical calculations. He worked with directors and producers to create advertisements designed to mesmerize mass consumers, brainwashing them into spending every cent to feel a manufactured want. But love wasn't a product you could buy, take, or sell. The happily ever after Disney narratives and the American dreams of a home and happy family were, to him, mere fantasies. Once that tangible satisfaction of being loved is gone, everything turns to ashes, meaningless fragments in a ceramic jar. In the wake of that disappearance, there is only a hollow despair, a longing for what used to be. Sensing the conversation was pulling Hanalei into a dark spiral, Coco clapped her hands, her sharp movement breaking the tension. "Anyone want coffee?" Several hands went up, including Jim's, thankful for the pivot. Hanalei quietly offered to help and followed her back into the crisp white sanctuary of the kitchen. Coco pulled the beans from the cupboard and began grinding them, the whirring sound filling the space while Hanalei sat on a stool, watching the steam begin to rise. "Thanks for stepping in to help," Coco said, turning to him with a gentle smile. "But listen, you should prepare answers for their curious questions in advance, especially among these social butterflies. They live for gossip." As the coffee maker started dripping hot water, the rich, sweet aroma of Kona coffee began to fill the room, grounding the high-strung energy of the night. You were trying to speak your truth honestly, she continued softly. But in a conversation driven by pure curiosity, being sincere doesn't always help you. It just gives them more to pick at. I know, he replied, the scent of the coffee offering a small, bitter comfort. A little while later, Jim entered the kitchen, saying, "It smells great. Can I help with anything?" Coco reassured him, "No, it's fine." Jim touched Hanalei's shoulder and gently said, "If the conversation earlier made you uncomfortable, I didn't mean to pry. Don't worry about it." "Honestly, I'm not sure how to sort out my feelings myself," Hanalei said, looking at him with slightly sad eyes. Jim looked back at him gently and said, "If you ever want to talk, I'm here for you." Coco watched them, arranging coffee cups on the table and pouring the freshly brewed coffee, when suddenly the alarm at the entrance beeped and a woman with a Polynesian appearance entered the kitchen. Her name was Hina, and she stood at about the same height as Hanalei. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with long, wavy black hair that cascaded down to her waist, a well-proportioned, curvy figure, and beautiful, deep dark brown skin. In the language of the islands, she was a Māhū. While a modern outsider might simplify the term as a man in women's clothing, it was not an act of drag or female impersonation. That sat close to transgender identity, yet it carried a weight of cultural tradition that was entirely its own. In Hawaiian culture, the Māhū holds a unique and respected position. Historically, if a firstborn male chose or was chosen to take over a mother's burdens, raising siblings and managing maternal roles after she passed, they stepped into the sacred middle ground. It was a role defined by service and spirit rather than just anatomy. Native American cultures define similar souls as two: spirit, possessing both male and female spirits in one body. Some even argued it was a three: spirit state, including a neutralized, pure spirit that transcended the binary altogether. While these definitions could be confusing to those trapped in a Western mindset, the most important factor was the recognition of their existence and their right to be heard without judgment. At that time, these brave souls were still often eclipsed by the more visible gay and lesbian movements, living in the shadows of the community. Yet, they existed with a fierce, quiet persistence. And here Hina was, a living embodiment of that ancient, dual-natured strength. "Aloha, Coco. Sorry I'm late," Hina said softly, her voice resonating with a smooth, melodic depth that filled the kitchen. Coco introduced her to the group, but before the introductions were even finished, she noticed a radiant glow about Hina. "You seem happy tonight. Did something good happen?" Hina's eyes lit up with delight, and she began to hop excitedly on the marble floor, her long hair swaying with her movement. "Yes. I wanted to tell you first." "What happened?" Coco asked, her curiosity piqued. Hina grabbed Coco's shoulders, her energy infectious. "Jeremy, the one who does the choreography for the Volcano Party, he asked me to do a show." Coco's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in genuine shock. "Oh my God. Really?" "Yes." "Can you believe it?" Hina pulled her into a fierce hug, and for a moment the two of them were jumping together like schoolgirls. Jim, watching from the doorway, laughed in astonishment. "So you're going to be the circuit mama of Hawaii now?" "Yes, I am." Hina turned back to Coco, gripping her hands tightly, her face full of adoration. "And it's all thanks to you. You taught me, encouraged me, and supported me. You are my goddess, you know that, right?" "You're exaggerating," Coco replied, her voice softening. She cupped Hina's cheeks and gave her a congratulatory kiss on each side. "You achieved this because of your own hard work. I just helped a little. And I have a favor," Hina pleaded. "I want you to do the choreography with Jeremy." Hanalei, standing by the counter, was stunned. "Wow, I had no idea you did things like that," he said, looking at Coco with newfound respect. Hina beamed with pride on Coco's behalf. She used to headline shows in Waikiki clubs, she was invited to the mainland, and she even sang on cruise ships. "She also holds the Miss New York title," Jim added, throwing another log onto the fire of Hanalei's surprise. That was a long time ago, Coco said, a sudden cold edge sharpening her features. The light in her eyes dimmed as she looked at a distant point in her memory. I haven't performed since my surgery, she added with a cynical, tight smile, gesturing vaguely toward her chest. Jeremy can't handle it alone. She turned back to the coffee, the rhythmic dripping of the water the only sound in the sudden tension. I've already got Jeremy's approval, Hina persisted, her voice small but determined. Please do it with him. Coco looked into Hina's imploring eyes. For a split second, the barrier between her past and present blurred. She remembered the rush of the stage, the bright lights, and the temporary euphoria of being seen. But she also remembered that no matter how many titles she won in big cities, that success had never filled the void inside. It had been a performance in more ways than one. Please! Hina's face was so full of the same hope Coco once carried. Coco glanced up at the ceiling and let out a long, resigned sigh. If helping Hina meant stepping back into a world she thought she'd left behind, she would do it, not for the glory, but for the girl standing in front of her. Okay, Coco said quietly. If I can help, I'll do it. To be continued. Swim and listen to the historical gay drama in the center of the Pacific. We are releasing a brand new episode every single day until the epic conclusion of the story. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 15 to 45-minute hit of cinematic historical drama set in the tropical islands of Hawaii, the perfect daily plunge into the shattered world a millennium after 9/11. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full novel now. Bookmark Blue Dolphins. The Novel Playlist, A Great Argead Saga, Alexine, Volume 1, Talesius Playlist, Volume 2, Sacred Band Playlist, and Divine Oracle. Unwritten words behind my novel playlist. Subscribe to follow the waves and currents of Forbidden Paradise love tales. Comment below.